we are ready for kickoff, I think. So first of all, welcome to everyone, and it's wonderful. I can see lots and lots of people, which is fabulous. So thank you so much. If Lucinda, you can just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, okay? Yes, fantastic. So we've posed some questions for you today. The session today is all about academic impact. So there's some true or false questions there. I won't read them out, but if you pop over to slido.com and put in hashtag WINR, you can answer those questions, and then Lucinda will share with you a little bit later the answers. So welcome everybody. It's quite late in the year to be restarting this year. It's May already, I can't believe it. Apologies for the delay. I actually was stupid enough to lead a Centre of Excellence application, and that sort of pretty much wiped out any capacity to do anything else for the first few months of the year. But we are back now, and we'll be having our Women in Research sessions monthly until the end of the year. And I'm super happy that we've got back again today Tamara Davis, who is also an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow, and you'll hear a little bit more from her later. So let me just, anyone who's new, I will just explain the format to you. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and that is the land on which we here are on. Please share the land that you are on in the chat. People in Australia will know what I'm talking about. And we like to acknowledge the past owners of the land, and pay our respects, I guess, to those leaders that are past, present and emerging. So we very much acknowledge those important people. I'm going to talk a little bit about academic impact, and I will try to bring together some of the research that I've managed to pull together on this topic. I'll also share actually a few of my insights. Unfortunately, one of our ARC Laureate Fellows was ill today and wasn't able to be with us. So we have a little bit more time, which is fantastic because we always run out of time for questions, but today we won't. And after I've spoken, I will introduce Professor Tamara Davis. As you can see there, submit your questions using Slido or just pop them on the chat, and Lucinda will be keeping an eye on those. If you can mute yourself, but we do love to see faces, so do feel free to turn on your camera. And as I always encourage you to do, try not to be multi-skilling and doing too many other tasks. Maybe you're ironing or something like that, but try not to be checking your emails or writing a paper at the same time, because actually all the research shows we're not very good at dividing our attention in that way, although we like to fool ourselves and think that we are. But let's start with what is academic impact. And I managed to find this model called the Scholarly Capital Model, and I thought it was quite useful. It talks about three elements that define academic impact. And the first is what they call ideational influence, and this is really sort of citations, I guess. And the idea here being, if you're having an influence on ideas in the academic space, then people will be citing you. The second one is connectedness. And so this is where you sort of fit in the scholarly network, your reputation and whether how you're perceived, I guess, by your colleagues. And then the third one, I don't know why it's called venue representation. It seems a very weird, strange phrase to me, but anyway, that is really your representation in the collective knowledge of your field. And that's more about where is your work published. Again, a little bit reputational around, is your work published in those sort of high profile journals. So that's the model. I'm going to really focus on the citations today, and I'll explain why in one moment. But I think it's really important just to ask the question, why do we even care about academic discourse? Obviously, there's so much attention given these days to other forms of impact, policy impact, practical impact. I think that there can be a little bit of a sense of, well, why should we even care if other academics are just, it's just academics talking to themselves. Who really cares? Well, it's really important that we have academic impact, because we are actually trying to progress ideas and academic discourse. And academic impact is about understanding that people are actually hearing that and listening to the ideas that you put forward. And Will Harsing, who I'll talk about a little bit later, talks about if you don't have any academic impact, it's sort of like you're speaking, but no one is listening. Of course, having academic impact is really important for career elements, and many of us have filled in ARC grant applications, etc., and we know how important it is to be able to demonstrate your academic impact to get those sorts of grants. It's also important because you learn, if you look at who's citing you, whose work you're influencing, you learn who is actually building on your work, and they are a source of potential collaborators. Or potential people that you invite to a symposium. They are a group of people who care about the same ideas and things that you do. And so I think that is really important from a collaborative perspective, to have a look and see who is citing and drawing on your work. I think it gives you a sense of meaning, actually, if your work is having academic impact. I'm sure Tamara will share some stories later, but there's nothing more rewarding than going up to having some people come up to you at a conference and say, oh, your work has been so influential and, it has influenced what I do. It does give you a sense of meaning. And I've talked about this many times before. We live in a tough world as academics with a lot of rejection and a lot of workload. It's good to get these sort of little boosts of meaning. And if you've got other ideas of why academic impact is important, please do share them on the chat or on Slido. Now, one thing I'm just going to remind you, I'm not going to talk so much about the connectedness component of the scholarly model, because we had a session last December on networking and impact. And I just want to remind you, if you missed that, we talk a lot about the importance of connection and networks for having impact. So just go back and revisit that. On our Women in Research website, we've got copies of all the presentations from the past. But what this slide does show is that you can get this little bit of a virtuous circle happening. If you get one sort of impact, it tends to relate to the other sorts of impact, and that tends to have these consequences, creating funding, helping you to get funding. And if you've got funding, you've got more resources to have an impact on policy, and that's going to help with your career, and your career advancement is going to feed back into your academic impact and so on. So you can create some virtuous circles, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So I'm going to zero in on citations as an indicator of academic impact. And I understand that can be quite controversial, and in particular disciplines, this is a less relevant metric. I do believe that it's changing, though, in those disciplines, and I believe it will change more and more because this data is so available. So it's not perfect. So nobody is saying that every fantastic article in the world is cited a lot. There will be exceptions, absolutely. And equally, there'll be some pretty rubbish papers that are cited a lot too. So there are exceptions. But most of the time, citations are a pretty good indicator. And perhaps I love Anne Will Harsing said something like, it's a bit like democracy, citations. It's like, it's not perfect, but it's probably the best system that we've got. So why are citations useful? They are objective, and that's good, especially for women. Sometimes we've talked a lot about how women's performance is sometimes perceived differently to men. No one can argue with citations. They're transparent, and they're very readily available. I do think that, of course, historically, there's often been a lot of attention as to where you publish your work. And that's obviously great. And I'm going to actually talk about the link between where you publish your work and citations. But it is really important to know that, you can publish work that's never cited. So maybe citations do suggest something. And this article by Garfield, this is in 98, it's a little bit old, but 33 million articles, 56% received one citation, 3.6% got between 25 and 99 citations, and only about 0.5 received more than 100 citations. So those of you who, have only got one citation for one of your papers, don't despair. That's pretty normal. But what it does show that is you start to track the good numbers of citations for an article, then it is having an impact, and a bigger impact than most. And as I mentioned, it's only going to become more important because it's so easy to crunch this sort of data. But what I wanted to talk a little bit about now is, well, many of you will be wanting to have higher citations. We all agree they're important. How do we get them? What influences them? And I want to start with this question of, well, what predicts citations? Is it merit? Is it having a fantastic paper? Or is it other factors? And actually, the evidence shows it's a bit of both. Okay, so there is this Matthew effect that Merton talked about in 1968. And Merton had this idea that if someone famous has an idea, it's actually going to get recognised and attributed to that famous person much more quickly than if someone not so famous has that idea. And I bet some of you have experienced that in your careers already. You can see that quote there from Matthew. For all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. So the Matthew effect is this idea that if you get some early advantage, it can create this sort of positive spiral of advantage. And I'm not advocating this as a good thing. It's just what happens. So, for example, there's quite a lot of research in our field, and I think in other fields as well, that shows if you go to a prestigious institution to get your PhD, or you've got a prestigious supervisor, or both, you're more likely to have early publication success. That's going to then lead you to get a more prestigious academic appointment. That's going to enhance your productivity because you'll have more resources and colleagues nearby, etc. And that's going to contribute to your career success. So that's the idea of the Matthew effect. And there is quite a lot of evidence of that, and I'll share some of that with you. Let me start with this study. So this is a study, and I've already mentioned that there's a lot of papers out there that don't really get many citations at all. What this study shows is that 5% of the authors in this particular analysis accounted for 53% of the citations and 26% of the publications. So that's probably a little bit of evidence of the Matthew effect in operation. So these 5% of authors, are probably, well, in fact, I know for sure because I'm going to show you some of the research, but they are going to be coming out of those more advantageous situations. And so they then get that positive spiral effect happening. Here's another study just to give you another example. So this was looking at what predicts citations and productivity. Graduate school reputation is pretty important, and partly because it just matters, because you're more likely to get known, but also you're more likely, if you go to a sort of high profile graduate school, or where you do your PhD, to put it in Australian language, you're more likely to publish more, and you're more likely to end up being invited to be on an editorial board, etc. By the way, if this is depressing you because you didn't go to a very prestigious graduate school, don't worry, we're going to cover that shortly. One of the biggest predictors of citations is having a high number of publications in the better quality journals. That seems to be true across all fields. I looked at lots of different studies. This is a study from my field, but I looked at studies from other fields as well. So, for example, in this study, a 1 standard deviation increase in the number of Tier 1 publications was associated with a almost 25% increase in total citations. And second-tier publications also associated with an increase in citations. Interestingly, this study showed that if you had a lot of Tier 3 publications, that you were more likely to have fewer citations. Another study in our field, 78% of the high impact or highly cited articles were published in only 7 journals in a field with hundreds of journals. So this is a really important message that, and I'm going to show you my citations a bit later, and I think you'll see this effect playing out. Where you currently are doing your research is important. That predicts the citations. If you are on editorial boards, that predicts citations. If you have a larger number of co-authors, interestingly, that predicts citations. And I listened to Anne Wilhasing explaining that, and one of the reasons is potentially that your co-authors are all going to cite that piece of work, and so in a sense you're going to get more networks citing your work. Years in the field, of course, and this is something really important. You know, my citations are very different to someone who is earlier in their career for no other reason than the fact that I've been around a long time doing this. So longevity really matters here. This study shows, and this connects back to the previous presentation that we did around networks, that the number of strong ties that you have in your support network predicts your citations. So that's interesting. That's like the number of people in your professional network that you feel you could ask for help or you could call on. That predicts your citations over and above all of these other things. So again, a really good rationale for developing your support networks, as we've talked about many times before. Now, so you can see amongst these predictors of citations, some of the Matthew effect happening here, okay? You know, those high reputation places that you've done your PhD, etc. But you can also see some other things that are maybe more about the work and the way that you do it yourself. This is a very interesting study. It's sort of quite strange to me, but they measured the Matthew effect because they found that there was, well, you can see there, 4,000 or so studies, 4,500 articles that they found that had actually, the exact same article had been published twice in 2 different journals. One was a lower impact journal and one was a high impact journal. And what they wanted to understand is, because I've shared with you that high impact journals, if your work is published there, you know, you're going to be cited more. But you could argue, oh, that's just because those journals are better, and so it's better quality work. And that's what these guys wanted to understand. They want us to understand, is that what really is going on? Or is there some just reputational effect where people will cite it just because it's in a high impact journal? And so they found these studies that are duplicates, which I have to say sounds quite ethically dodgy to me, to be publishing the exact same article in 2 journals. I don't know whether that's okay in some disciplines. It certainly is not in our discipline, so this is not a recommendation. But the interesting thing from this study, of course, is that if this exact same article published in the high impact journal was cited almost double the amount of the exact same article in the low impact journal. So they use this as evidence just to say, actually, there is a reputational effect independent of the quality of the article. And I think we all sort of suspected that is true. And this probably just really makes that very clear. Gender matters. There is evidence, particularly in disciplines that have a higher proportion of men. So some of the more STEM disciplines, etc., that men do tend to cite other men more than women, even, you know, if other things are controlled for. There's also this thing called the Matilda effect, which is where women's ideas are seen as less important or attributed to men. Again, pretty sure some of you have experienced that, where you've had an idea and it's attributed to someone else and possibly a male. So I guess what this also shows is part of that Matthew effect or advantage, you know, for women in science, particularly in those disciplines with high proportion of men like STEM, you know, citation things, a bit like teaching ratings, may be a little bit biased, and it's really important to remember that. And if you're ever in a promotion situation, you know, you may want to remind your reviewers of some of these biases. But look, that's might seem a pretty depressing story so far. There's also other research that shows, yes, you know, journal quality matters, gender matters, prestige of your PhD institution matters, but so do other things. So these studies show the importance. These tend to be studies where people who've written high impact articles have been interviewed or have been compared with people who don't write high impact articles or whatever. And there is evidence that people who are really passionate about their research, they've got a strong personal interest in their article, in that topic, that contributes to the high impact. So this article by Ashford talks about these home run articles, very American, but talking to authors and saying, well, why did this paper of yours that attracted, say, I don't know, 3,000 citations, why did that, what's different about that compared to some of your other articles? And the authors would talk about how that article was really, really passionate to them. They're really committed to it. And even though it might have been a bit risky, because of that personal passion and commitment, they were willing to sort of really push it through. There's lots of other articles around you know, that compare, they take articles that have been highly cited and articles that haven't been highly cited and try to understand why. And often there is a difference in quality. So it's not all just factors like where you did your PhD. There is a difference in quality. Highly cited papers tend to have a stronger theoretical element. Review papers, meta-analysis type papers tend to be more highly cited, and I'm going to show you evidence of that in my own profile. There's evidence where they do studies where they rate the, they get independent reviewers to rate the topic and whether it's sort of seen as important and whether it's seen as perhaps a broader topic that might be cited in other disciplines. There's evidence if your work fits into that category, it's more likely to be cited. And then the quality of your writing and the methods also matter. So quality work matters in terms of work being cited. So it's not all about gaming. It is about, and I think that would be my overarching message to you, that the fundamental goal here is to do great work. And that is really important for impact. One interesting thing, and people have said this to me, is that, oh, you know, I'll do my really impactful work when I've got, you know, when I'm more established, when I've got tenure, when I'm more senior. Actually, this study showed, analysed all of the high impact articles, highly cited articles in a particular period, and showed that more than half of them actually were written when the author was early in their career or in the American system pre-tenure. So that's really important. To try to avoid falling into that trap of thinking, oh, I'll do it later when I'm more senior and I'm more established. So what does all this mean in terms of having academic impact? So the first conclusion I would suggest that comes from all this research is to write good articles, and they're more likely to be high impact articles if you try to publish them in the best journals. And that, of course, this is sort of another topic, but that means learning the skills as to how you publish in those best journals. And if you're someone who wants to learn those skills, you know, maybe that's something we could talk about a different day. But, you know, reading the journals, attending journal editor panel discussions, getting feedback at conferences, all those sort of things help you get the skills to publish in the best journals. Develop a program of research that builds on your earlier work and is programmatic. This can really help because you start to build around you colleagues and a community of people that are all interested in your work. If you're flicking all the time from topic to topic, it's very hard to get that sort of reputation and network that ends up being quite important in having impact. I mentioned before that the bigger questions seem to get, the big broader questions in the field seem to ultimately attract more citations. But of course, you know, you need to break those down into manageable size chunks, but keep the focus on the big questions. So it's about recognizing you're answering a big important question, but you're doing it in a manageable way. Of course, I've mentioned that if you're advancing the field by methods or innovation or theory, that's going to make a difference. I think one of the most important messages, and by the way, this paper that I've cited here is a really nice paper for anyone who wants to delve into any of these ideas in a bit more depth. I think the most important one, personally, for me at least, has been focusing on what you believe is important and interesting, and not just clocking up more and more papers. And I do experience a lot of conversations with junior people who want to just clock up papers. That ultimately doesn't sustain your interest. And what you see with academic impact is that longevity, and just keeping going and having that sort of commitment to a theme is what can really help. But beyond writing the great article and trying to publish it somewhere good, you also should proactively collaborate and communicate. And I know that Tamara is going to talk about the collaboration a bit, so I'll leave that one for the moment. But and what I want to really encourage you to do, if you haven't already, is go to Anne Will Harzing's wonderful website called harzing.com that has got some fabulous resources, including some YouTube. So she's got one called the 4 C's to Citations, and her 4 C's are competence, which is really what we've been talking about. You know, do good quality work. So that's number 1. Communication, no good doing great work if you don't get it out there and communicate to people. Collaboration, we've talked about that in the past, and and Tamara will pick that up a bit later. And then she talks about, you know, just investing and caring about your own academic reputation, because in a sense there's nothing more important than your academic reputation, but also caring about the reputation of others. So have a look at that YouTube. It really reiterates some of the messages that I've already been talking about. This is her 7 steps to improving reputation and impact through communication. By the way, this is one of the questions that you guys asked. What are the benefits of social media and outreach for building academic input? And in fact, and directly is advocating the importance of making the most of communication and social media. So I encourage you to go and have a little look at that if you don't. But she talks about, you know, make sure you've got a really good version, a pre-publication version of your paper in your university repository, so that when people are clicking on it in ResearchGate, it's there. And I'm feeling guilty as I say these things because I don't always do it myself. But, you know, keeping your Google Scholar and your ORCID profile, making sure they're up to date. They can feel like tedious bureaucracy. But if you're not making your paper available, then of course people can't cite it. And it's so important now because there is so much information. We live in a world of just information overload and so many papers. So you being a little bit proactive about making sure your paper is available and communicating your paper, you know, can make all the difference. And Anne actually talks about how, you know, most academics are pretty introverted. And so things like LinkedIn are beautiful for academics because they're a way of disseminating your research, you know, without actually having to talk to anyone. She talks about the importance of Twitter and LinkedIn, you know, that your paper's been published. She talks about the importance of sending papers to colleagues in your field. People do that to me now all the time, and it's great because I don't have time to proactively look for papers anymore. So when they land in my inbox with somebody highlighting why this paper is so relevant and I should look at it, I'm about, I'd say about 90 times more likely to look at it than, you know, if they don't do that. Sometimes I won't, but that's okay, right? It won't be perfect, but sometimes I will, and that's what you're hoping for. And then, of course, you can go further and you can write blogs, and you can do conversation. You can even write blogs within LinkedIn. So if anyone's not confident or not feeling they're not doing some of this stuff, I really encourage you to go to harsing.com and have a look at Anne's steps there. So I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to talk for about 5 minutes about my own citations and why I feel a little bit like, you know, an accidentally highly cited person. So I, a few years ago, was named as one of these Clarivate highly cited authors in our field. And honestly, it did feel a bit accidental because I think my mindset was actually stuck back in the early days of my career where no one ever seemed to cite me. And it was a real source of frustration. It's like, why doesn't anyone ever cite me? It took a long time for me to get cited. And then weirdly, you know, now I'm highly cited. So why? And I thought it might be useful for me to reflect on that. And I think one of it is I've just stuck at this for a long time. And I do have these two key themes, and I'll show you them in a minute. And I am passionate about them, and people who know my research know that. And I think that passion, that genuine interest, has enabled me to keep going on those topics, and that has made a big difference. You know, one of my areas is work design, and I vividly remember at a conference somebody saying to me, why are you doing research on work design? It is a dead topic. It has been thought of, at least in the US, in our field, as a sort of dead topic for many years, but it is resurging now. And so this is why, you know, you stick with what you believe in. It will become important one day. When you look at some people's citation profiles, you'll see they've got a huge big paper that's got 1 million citations. Mine, actually, I don't have that, but I've got quite a lot of papers that have a decent number of citations. And I've published mostly tier 1 and tier 2 journals, but not always. There are exceptions to that. I have had great students who've gone on to be very prolific and collaborative. I have had great collaborators, and I collaborate a lot across the world, UK, US and Asia. And I think sometimes I do bridge. One of the studies that we talked about in our last session was about how if you bridge networks, so it's not about having 1 million people in your network, it's about bridging networks, you often tend to be more impactful. I think I bridge some of those networks because I have connections in all of those countries. I have had huge resources in the last few years. That's really important for everyone to understand. And so that Matthew effect has sort of kicked in for me, which is good. I've written a lot of book chapters. Now, I've put question mark whether this helped or not. I think it actually did help me to build my reputation, because I think eventually I wrote so many book chapters on work design, people would just go, oh, she's the work design person, even probably before I published too much on that topic. And a final factor, I think, is I've genuinely tried to be more proactive in recent years about communicating. I don't think I was very good at this for the first 15, 20 years of my career, but definitely have improved. And I think it makes a difference. So let's have a look at my papers. These are my top 7 cited articles. And as I mentioned, I don't have a small number of articles with 1 million publications. I've sort of got more with quite you know, a decent number. The first thing you'll note that 2 of my top 7 were written in the first 4. I got my PhD in 94, so 4 years within that period. So that resonates with that finding about don't think it's only the work you're going to do later. It can be the work that you do now. These groups of papers fit into my 2 themes. I mentioned I have 2 themes, so they sort of build on each other. In terms of the sort of work, the first one is a new model of performance. The next one's a new concepts. So you see that new concept, new model type of effect that I mentioned gets more cited. You also see that synthesis and review type of work can sometimes be cited, and you see that there in those 3 papers there. In terms of what sort of articles, Most of them are tier 1, tier 2. I put tier 1, 2 because it depends which ranking system you look at, but they're all tier 1 or tier 2, and one is a book. So that sort of fits with that theme of the papers. And then I've just put in here a couple of newer papers, because those are obviously pretty old, that are being cited quite a lot. So here's one, 2019, that's being cited. So this is, again, a tier 1, tier 2, depending on the ranking system type of paper. And it's actually a combination of a review and a new model. So it's a synthesis, and then out of that emerges a new model. Whoops. And I should have had an early in career signal here. This Fang Fang, who wrote this paper as the lead, is an early career researcher. And ditto for this second one, which is 2021 and already cited 425 times. Well, why is this being cited so much? It is not a tier 1 paper. This is probably tier 2, maybe tier 3, depending on the system. But why is this cited so much? Well, we got it out quickly. So it was a new application of an idea that was very timely, because it's obviously about remote working during the pandemic. So that timeliness factor really kicked in there. So that is it for me. So what I've tried to do there is just sort of link some of the research findings with a sort of very crude little analysis of my own citations. So I hope that was interesting to you. I'm going to now hand you to ARC Laureate Fellow Tamara Davis, who is from the University of Queensland and a completely different discipline, cosmology. And she spends most of her time trying to figure out why the expansion of the universe is accelerating, searching for dark energy. It's such a beautiful topic. So absolutely delighted to have Tamara back. She was a real hit when we had her on before. And she's going to share with you some of her tips around academic impact, and then we'll go to Lucinda for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we should be going to Tamara. So you'll just jump in, Tamara, whenever you're ready.
Great. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Sharon. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for having me. Yes, my name's Tamara, and I work at the University of Queensland. I'm a cosmologist. And so I study, as Sharon said, the expansion of the universe. I try and understand why the expansion is accelerating, this dark energy that we don't know what it is, and see if we need like a quantum theory of gravity, maybe. So that's my background. In 2017, the Australian Academy of Science gave me the Nancy Millis Medal, which is for outstanding female leadership in science. And I got an Order of Australia in 2020. And I was reflecting on the fact that, you know, as 20 years ago, sitting in my PhD room as an extremely introverted, very shy PhD student, it's doing my calculations of how the universe expands. I would never have imagined that I would be leading groups of hundreds of researchers spread around the world trying to understand the universe, doing that in groups with projects that, you know, span more than a decade of effort, and, you know, advising government on policy, and at the same time appearing in science movies and documentaries, and even hosting TV documentaries. So I was going to reflect a little bit with you on a couple of like small anecdotes of things that helped me have impact in my career, and mention the things that I think really help increase your citation impact and your academic impact. So as Sharon mentioned, impact does come in many forms. At the very heart of it, the foundation is really doing research that advances your field and research that gets used. From that can arise all sorts of other influencing the direction your field takes, influencing policy, influencing public opinion, education, and mentoring the next generation. So a lot of my impact has actually come through the students and postdocs that I've helped mentor that have gone on to other great things in either academia or industry and done a whole bunch of amazing things. So Yeah, so the number one thing is probably doing, as this was something that was Sharon brought up, and as you were talking, I kept thinking of other things that, I should say this, but I'll try and keep it concise and leave lots of time for questions. But firstly, you have to get to a place where you have influence. So you have to do the research. That's the basis of everything. So before being invited to give talks on television and things like that, you have to have something to say. I agree that you don't have to worry so much about whether your research is going to have impact. If you're doing something that you're really excited about, it's very likely that it's something exciting that other people are going to get excited about as well. So I don't worry, is this topic that I'm researching the thing that's going to give me the most impact? Like, maybe there's a little bit of that in the back of my mind, but really I do something that I find exciting. And that has proven to me to be a really good way to do stuff that other people are interested in as well. And if you do a really good job at it, then you sort of get the recognition. So the other thing was, like, it's not enough to do the research. You have to have other people knowing that you've done the research, knowing that you've got those results. So it's really important to be visible. And I think if you were here on the last time I gave a talk on one of these, I had a little story about during my PhD, after I'd given I'd given a talk at a conference, and I was down at a conference in Canberra, and I was super engaged in that conference. I was just really genuinely interested in all of the research that other people were doing. And so I put my hand up lots and asked lots of questions about the research that they were doing. And that I realized later got me noticed because I was asking good questions. And at the end of the conference, over a beer at the conference barbecue at the end, one of the profs approached me and said, "Hey, what are you doing after your PhD?" And long story short, they basically offered me a job then and there. And that's how I got to work with Brian Schmidt and Saul Perlmutter, who would together go on to win the Nobel Prize a little bit later. So that was a really good connection to make. And it came about because I was visible at a conference and I was asking questions, because prior to that, he didn't really know me. So yeah, you want to be visible to an extent that when one of your colleagues in the field gets asked a question about the subject that you're the specialist in, they're going, yeah, that's Tamara's area. You should go and talk to her. And once you start getting that network and being visible in that way, that's can go very far. Another couple of points are work with great people. That's super important. If you can be collaborative and you can work with great people, Sharon mentioned the fact that if you have good collaborations and good support networks, then people are more likely to cite you, and that's part of that, being known for doing that thing. So that's one really good thing. Also, have the best data. If you're working with data, as I am with astrophysics, so I actually grew up as a theorist. My PhD was entirely theory, but then I started working with big data sets. And when we go out and collect data in astrophysics projects, it's typically an effort for the ones that I've been involved in. It's a minimum 15-year effort to get the data. So it involves designing the project, designing the camera, figuring out the telescope, getting it mounted, built. Some of this involves designing the silicon chips, and so working with people who are doing that to make the digital cameras and things, getting it launched, doing at least 5 years of observations once it is on the telescope, and then analysing that data. And the papers that come out after an effort like that are guaranteed to be really high impact because no one else has anywhere near that data. So every time we've done one of those surveys, and I've always had like a few overlapping, you end up with sort of a really incredible data set that reveals a whole bunch of things. So we're very accustomed in astrophysics to working on projects where in one PhD, there's no chance that you're going to get to the end of the data collection. And so we publish things on the way of what's like preliminary results and stuff like that. So students get their acknowledgement and things like that. But that sort of thinking on a really large scale can be really, really impactful. Another thing is being generous with authorship. If someone's helped you with the paper and stuff, offer them authorship. It is actually a really good way to get more citations, because they're going to cite you more if they're also on the paper and that kind of thing. And also making your work really useful. So some of the highest impact papers that I've been involved with have been ones. So one that I was on in 2007, I joined this collaboration, which was using supernovae to measure the expansion rate of the universe and this dark energy stuff. And I had joined the collaboration a bit late. Everyone had had their projects already sort of spoken for. And so when I stepped in, I had to be really innovative and thinking in a different way. And so I came up with a different project where I could test lots of different cosmological models against this data. But at the same time, to do that, I had to pull in a whole bunch of different data sets. So this was one of those compilation sort of data set moments. And the data set that I collected to do the analysis that I needed ended up becoming one of the leading data sets in the field that was then used by everybody. And by making that data set easy to use and public, so it was on my website, it was easily downloadable, it had code that you could use to upload it and just use it yourself. It meant that paper got a huge number of citations, because not only because of the analysis, but because the data was available. And something like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey is a great example of a group of people who did some amazing research themselves, but the vast majority of their citations came from other people using the data that they released and made public and used online. So I have a whole bunch of other things that I could talk about in order to get, but I'll be really quick. In order to get known in the field, a really good thing to do is to run conferences and workshops. If you're inviting your favorite people in the field that you think are the most impressive to come and speak at your conference, it's a great way to get known by the leaders in the field if you're leading. Also, get on review committees and referee papers. There's nothing teaches you how to write a great grant or write a good paper than reading other people's papers and grants and learning how to what makes a good and a bad paper in that process. And give lots of public talks. So I could go on, but I think I want to leave time for questions. But those are a few of the tidbits of things that I think are really useful ways to have great impact with you in academia.
Thank you so much, Tamara. That's brilliant. And we always complain about it taking like several years to collect data, but I'm not going to complain anymore after hearing your story. 15 years. Wow. So thank you so much. Yeah. And over to our wonderful PhD student, Lucinda, who's going to run the questions and share the Slido results, I believe. Lucinda, over to you.
Yeah. So I'll do the Slido first so I don't forget about it. Let me just share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Oh, I can't hear you guys. Oh, beautiful. So the first question that was asked, are papers more likely to be highly cited if they're published in top tier journals? And 77% agreed that that was true. We've heard a lot about that one today. This one was very close, which was interesting. Over 90% of highly cited articles are published by senior authors who are at least associate professor level. Very tight race between true and false in that one.
You're on mute, Sharon.
Oh, sorry. I'm just saying the data that I shared was in our discipline, which showed that about 50% of high impact articles were early career articles. It could be in other disciplines that this is more true. So like, for example, in your discipline, Tamara, it might be truer because of those data collection efforts.
Yeah, I think a lot of the really highly cited papers are led by the early career researchers, though. I think that, yeah, I agree that that's I would have answered this one, early career researchers. Yeah.
Excellent.
Which is a nice encouraging piece of feedback for early career researchers, I think. On average, papers are more likely to be highly cited if they are written by a man rather than woman. 70% agreed that that was true, which is a bit disappointing. And the academic impact of your article is completely out of your hands, and 85% agreed that that was false, which is nice to know. And hopefully that's changed to 100% agree after today. In terms of the Q&A, we had some really good questions in the chat that I think might be nice to hear your opinions on. You both talked a lot about pursuing your passions and kind of citations coming and flowing from being really interested in what you're interested in, if that makes sense. And someone asked whether you see if there's a risk for researchers pursuing only what's of interest to them. If that becomes quite a niche topic, is that going to be a risk for getting funding or job opportunities in the future?
Tamara, you go for it.
I think it is possible that you're interested in something that is completely boring to everybody else, but I feel like it's not likely. Usually, if you're getting excited by something, it's because it's genuinely interesting. And it is important to be aware that maybe you're going down a rabbit hole that is a detail that's not important. So if you're getting a bit detailed focused and going like too far in one direction, it's possible that that's becoming a bit too niche. But if you're worried about that kind of thing, chat to other people. And I find, so they can help you judge that. And like, it's always good to not just introspect, but get other people's opinions. I think if you go to a conference and you give a talk on a topic and you listen to what other people are talking about, that also can give you a good gauge for if the stuff that you are finding exciting is exciting to other people as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tamara. I would just say that I think the risk is greater the other way, that people do things because they think it's going to have impact and they do that gaming, and then actually they're not really interested. They haven't really got the resilience and grit that it requires because of that to persist and so on. So I actually think the risk is greater the other way. Of course, you could do something that you're passionate about that no one else cares about. It's possible, but I agree, completely unlikely. And personally, I gave that story of my area of research that many people told me was dead. That's work design, and it sort of was dead in America at that time, but I didn't care. I actually just really thought it was important, and it sort of got me fired up. And that was important because I kept going, and that is the topic that my laureate ended up being on. So a bit of sensitivity to feedback, but
yeah. I might just quickly add that if you try to game the system and think of the thing that everybody is finding interesting in that moment, you're probably already behind, because you're trying to do something that everybody is already finding interesting and a lot of people are already invested in, and you're really starting from behind. So if you do the new thing, if you think of the new thing ahead of people being interested in it, then you become the trailblazer.
Another question that I liked was from Janie quite early on, and she asked, how do you evidence impact when there are minimal or no citations, especially in practical disciplines where the evidence is used in practice? And she talked about nursing, where the work might result in change and have impact in bedside practices, but maybe not in citations. Is there anything that you can kind of do to manage that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And just to say, Janie, we are going to have another session on impact outside of academia. So by focusing on academic impact, we're not saying the other sort of impact is unimportant. Of course, it's important, but we also think that the academic impact is important if you're an academic. So look, I would say, from a career perspective, those sort of papers are fabulous. But if they're the only papers that you're publishing, it's going to be hard to influence the research and the academic discussion in the topic if it's not getting picked up by other academics. So it might be a case of, just positioning for a different journal or something like that. But yeah, not all disciplines are the same, and we've got to always be recognising that. So thank you for the question. Tamara, do you have anything on that one?
I think that mostly is what I would have said too.
Another one was balancing metrics like the H index with citations. you could combine the results of several experiments to get an article in a higher tier journal, or publish them separately in 2 or more articles in a lower tier journal. How do you balance that tension?
For me, that one is easy. Go for the higher tier and put them all together. And
Yep.
part of the, I think the problem happens is we always think we're going to carve up and do 3 papers, and you never do. You know, you often only do 1, and then you're on to your next data set or your next challenge. So I would always advise do the best paper you can first. And then if, you know, there's leftover opportunities, of course, exploit them. But I'm not keen on that carving up strategy, especially if it's going to reduce the quality of the work. Tamara, you're nodding.
I'm going, yeah, 100%. There's no question at all. Always do, like, 1 highly cited paper in a good journal is way, way better than many lesser cited papers underneath that. And when you're looking to write grants and stuff, you can really look at a whole bunch of different ways to make your citations look as good as they can. So if your H-index is really great, so you've got a large number of papers with a reasonable number of citations, that's great. You can use that. You can also mention, you know, I have this one paper that was that paper that I was mentioning before. It was in the top 10 most highly cited papers in the field for the 5 years after it was published. And that kind of sentence is way better than having a whole bunch of medium cited papers. So you can also highlight that in your grants.
And just if I can jump in here, in terms of which citation metric to use, we didn't go into that today, but if you want to know, have a look at Anne Wilharsing, so harsing.com. Actually, she analyzes, and for early career researchers, there's one called H1 or something, I've forgotten, but she really advocates strongly different disciplines, different metrics, etc. So have a look on her website. Yeah. Can we squeeze one more in, Lucinda, or do you think we've run out of time?
Maybe one more?
Yeah, quick. Go quick. Sorry, Tamara, I jumped in there.
Sarita asked, and this might be another whole seminar kind of question potentially, but Sarita just asked, you talked about developing a program of research that builds on your own work. How do you balance that against the requirement for funding tenders on specific topics?
And you've got 30 seconds, Tamara.
We don't usually have funding tenders on particular topics, so that's not as relevant for astrophysics, I think. I would say that I have done quite a diversity of topics, but they all are based on that same theoretical underpinning. So it's using many different observational techniques to look at the same question, essentially. So my brand as such is quite diverse observationally, but concise on the particular question I'm asking.
But I might take that as a cue for a session, maybe around building a program of research, because that's really what that's about. And some of the trade-offs, you know, and figuring out how to say no and all that sort of thing. So that is a great question that we might leave for another day.
Stay tuned.
Yeah. So thank you so much. And I can see we've had more than 168, I think, or 69 people on the call today. Lots of people are dropping off because they're all rushing off to other things. So just in the last minute, I would just love to thank you all for coming along. We can't do this without you, and it's fabulous to have interest. And thank you so much to Tamara for coming again. Great to get your insights. And thank you to Lucinda and the other team who are not visible, Isabel and others who are behind the scenes. Thank you all so much, and stay tuned for next month's session, which we will let you know about soon.